Hey guys, welcome back to another video of the Assemble City review. The stitch was part of the sort of initial concept that we did, where I was showing in the last video the sort of sleep, work, play, in terms of how we sort of separate up the functions into these little sort of categories. I think I came towards the sort of end of the sort of concept stage in the university where I realised that this concept wasn't actually working. I think it was too sort of uniform, too systematic, too broken up. I really wanted to reconnect the site, not sort of break it up and overanalyze the programs of where they're going, which I think this is what this whole sleep, work, play was doing. Say with the programs, if we have sleep, work, play as in, say this is sleep here, then we have play here, and then we've got work over here. So if there are sort of three functions, or three groups of categories I should say, then essentially what we're doing is saying that you can only go to like play if you've worked, or there's no sort of direct route through, and it's kind of like you've got to almost fulfill one function before you move on to the other. And that just really wasn't what I wanted to do at all. So for the review, we literally submitted the history analysis that we've gone over. We submitted the concept analysis that we've gone over, and we also submitted the site analysis. And we combined that all into one document, show our progression of the scheme so far, which is a normal practice to do in university when you're sort of studying, is that you'll have a sort of tutorial checkup or a project checkup to really see sort of how you're doing, where you're going with the project. Because obviously if you've gone off on a massive tangent that doesn't actually meet the brief at all, your sort of tutors will try and steer you back into the sort of clear of where you should be heading. One point that my tutor Paul actually picked up on. Paul wasn't my actual tutor. Paul was just there for the crit pretty much. One of the points that Paul mentioned was that essentially this is our building here. As we were discussing in the last episode, how we kind of went in a full circle and came back to this point where the building sort of is sitting in the middle here. Imagine this is where we ended up, right back here at the very start. And you've got all these sort of functions around the area. And that this building here is actually just a sort of infill of the site, which is good, because it protects the buildings underneath, and it also gives new life to the buildings underneath. It gives them a new purpose, a new sort of reconnection. And so what Paul essentially was saying was, is this going to be a ratio of 1-to-1 where you've got work, sleep, and play? Is that essentially how it's going to work? Because if it is going to work like that, then it is sort of too uniform and it's too dependent on the system of three things being separated up. Whereas if you were then to say break it up, as we sort of tried with that sort of development work that I showed previously, where the sort of concept of moving the work, sleep and play all the way around and sort of making them sporadic and sort of changing in the actual infill of the site, then that could potentially work in a way. So instead of having actual three separated layers here, we might put work there, might put sleep there, might put play there. And so all these groups of functions then become sort of interlinked within each other, instead of them being completely separated and disconnected from each other. That was one of the sort of main points in the whole ratio of 1-to-1-to-1. I'll sort of show you a quick demonstration on the screen of what Paul was, on the image that Paul wrote that feedback on. So yeah, essentially this is what this sort of ratio 1-to-1-to-1 meant. How are these functions going to interlink with each other? Because he referenced back to my previous concept where I said we're going to take these programs, as I've sort of mentioned in the previous video, take the programs out of the site that they've lost and actually reconnect them to the site. One of the things I would recommend doing now, looking back in hindsight, is actually developing a section for this sort of work, because in a sort of plan-based scenario, when you're just doing purely plan, like these floorboards sort of thing, in a way, these floor plates, you kind of lose the aspect of a section through there if you're just designing on one plane. And a sort of real problem of designing purely through plan is that you don't actually understand it vertically. I mean, you might have an idea in your head, but when you actually take it to, say, your tutor or a client, it might be extremely difficult for them to actually picture what you have in your head. In this sense, what Paul basically was saying was that, how do these spaces work with each other? Sort of, is this all just going to be floor plates and sort of uniform scheme where you've just got slats and slats and slats of floor plates? And is it going to be too uniform? Is it going to be too sort of rigid and heavy that you don't really understand the programs because of the floor plate is a completely different type of structure? You know, if you've got your sort of sporadic diagrams or even your uniform programs, then how does that floor plate structure interlink with those programs? Because obviously you can't have solid uniform floor plates if you have a completely sporadic program. The sort of multi-use spaces, going a bit further with that, when we actually break down sort of work, the sleep and the play, it's like, what are these functions? Do you have an idea of these functions? What are they going to be? And essentially the sort of programs can be broken up and developed further. Because if you imagine a sort of studio space for work, how do these spaces work? Are they able to sort of break up and become adaptable and change into something else? Like, can you have, say, a good example would be in play, sort of a cinema room that can then change into sort of auditorium that could be connected to a school. So once everyone's out of school, does that school then change into something completely different that can be reused and actually save space instead of having multiple functions that all do the same thing effectively? Really thinking about, what does a function require? What does a function need to be a function to fulfill the need of that sort of space? What do I need to include in it? And it's like, you've obviously got your one-off spaces, like say a swimming pool, you know, but you could then say it's a leisure suite and you can include a gym and a sauna and a spa, and then the spa can go onto a hotel, you know, and that can sort of become residential, and then straight away you're sort of combining the sleep and the play. So I mean, it's obviously work as well in a way, but essentially what I'm trying to say is that you've gone from putting a single space in a single category to then completely interlinking three spaces together that fulfills all three categories, which then in essence fulfills the needs of the site because we've reconnected the site. Another interesting point raised up in this sort of internal crit review sort of thing was, obviously, as I mentioned before about the school closing and then being used for something else, it was very specific on how do these programs then change throughout the day. Do they become something else? It's a bit like when the cinema's closed, as I've just said, does it go into an auditorium? This was quite interesting because Paul did give me sort of the inspiration of Mobius House, which is essentially a building that is, well, it's a house built by UN Studio, which sort of rotates around in a sort of figure-8 shape. And essentially what they did was they mapped out all the client's needs, and picked throughout the day how the clients use the house. So essentially, if the client was, say, getting up at 8 AM every single day and then they'd go to sort of home work, or, you know, they completely tracked the whole thing. And I think it was off, I think they based it off a Mobius strip, as I remember. It is a really interesting building because they then essentially mapped that to sort of daylight hours in, I don't know where the building was, but they essentially mapped it to those specific points of the day. Client essentially was always in daylight or always in nighttime whenever they used the sort of function that that room was built for. And the reason it's on sort of figure 8 was because of when they track the client's movements, it sort of follows the Mobius strip in a way. And that was quite interesting. And another one that I've just thought of was I've seen a program diagram by OMA, who I think it was for an art centre or something along those lines, and essentially they broke down a whole program based on when it's going to be open, what it's going to be used for, what time of day things are going to be going on. Quite intricate in the details of time and program and human function, and how we sort of connect all these three sort of major keystones of development into a program, and how we really sort of fulfill that spatial matrix that goes into the building, which is sort of what I wanted to really bring a lot of that strong essence into this project. So as we've mentioned in the last one, in the very last video, we started developing sort of buildings like this with a sort of open internal courtyard space like this. And essentially what happens with this going forward is, this was probably the main point of the review, to be honest. That one little diagram that I showed last week where they they really liked this diagram because it actually started looking at it in section and thinking about it more vertically than just sort of plan. And a really interesting point with this one was that when the sort of daylight comes in, you can actually see around the building and everything, you know, that light well acts to fulfill the whole building, not just one room or one floor. And another problem with sort of just thinking about it in plan is if you've got a really deep plan, then chances are it probably will not get any light right in the centre of that plan. And you can do a whole sort of wide range of things on SketchUp or Revit to actually figure out whether your building will get light. And as I vaguely remember, when I did design this initial floorboard thing on Revit, as a sort of first initial review, it didn't get any light at all. So that's why I had to completely sort of change up sort of how I was approaching the project and what the building was actually going to be used for. Because in a way, if you've designed the space and it doesn't correlate with the program, or you haven't really chosen your program yet and how the program functions internally, then when you come to match them two together, they're just going to clash. Which was a learning point for me on this project, because I had sort of a breakdown system of a program and a breakdown system of a uniform sort of floorboard slat-like structure. And by that point, I'd realised that this program doesn't correlate with this. So I need to change the internal program to actually correlate to the internal structure. And then eventually, they will sync together and sync up to make the building. Another point is the single height, double height, or triple height sections. So, as you can imagine, some of these projects, like say cinema, not projects, some of these functions, like a cinema, would need a triple height space or double height space, or maybe even bigger. And that was something that completely lacked in this review. The sections, there was no sections anywhere, it was literally purely plan. Trying to think about everything holistically in terms of how does this program fit in this space, as I've just been talking about then. And if you imagine this sort of cinema space, there's like say let's go for three stories for now, 3 stories tall, which then sort of converts into an auditorium, so you've got a slant there. It's like, how does this space fit there? How does this space fit underneath here? So maybe you might have a drinks thing under here, you don't really, that's the whole point of what I think Paul was trying to get across to me, was that if I've just got these boards like this, it's great for an internal point, for a massing point, but I think in future I'd probably do massing as solid blocks instead of these sort of floor plates, because I think probably one of the biggest difficulties I had was I think I had good ideas in the project, and in my head I could almost visualise how this plan here was going to fit together. Now we were going to create a building there. Whereas when I bring it to the actual review, because I'd thought about it so much in my head, and everyone thinks when they go into review, I've thought everything out completely, and sometimes you just completely miss the mark and you fly straight over that concept and fly straight over that review. And it's almost like the teachers have got to bring you back in and say, you've missed this, you've completely missed the project brief, or etc. So this here, when I used to think about that, I was like, oh yeah, I know what that's going to look, I know that's in my head. It's great in your head, but it's not on the scheme. If you want us to critique on your scheme, then you need to produce the work to show it on the scheme. With this review, I would have actually added more sections I would have broke up the floor plate, and I would have done the massing to match the actual programs. So say the programs, if I'm thinking sporadic, if I've got a grid of programs that I know are going to fit round about where, then I would sort of interconnect them. And then once I've sort of done that, I would then put a section through that and figure out how these spaces are then going to actually have access to meet each other and connect. So it's sort of almost completely disassembling that whole work, sleep, play structure and sort of connecting them up as individual spaces, not necessarily the system of spaces. We'd still probably have some form of groups, like sort of grouping at the top where we've got, say, sleep, work, play, but it wouldn't be as vague as that. It would be sort of specific needs for specific rooms based on either size or functionality, essentially. This is a great comment for me, because it's sort of, when you've sort of had a good review, you feel great, you feel fantastic. And a good thing about this review was I came out of it with the sort of comment of a very rich scheme. Now you could see that as a massive, like a great comment, you know, you just finished a crit and you're like, yes, love my life, you know. Problem with it being a very rich scheme is the word rich, because rich sort of constitutes there being a lot of things going on. And that was the problem with this scheme, was there was just too much going on. And you know, you can take it as a positive where, yes, it's great as a sort of the initial, but then you sort of look past the facade and you realise that because it's such a rich and complex scheme that you have to do, say, 10 times the amount of work as you would normally when you're designing a project to actually fulfil the needs for this scheme. And that wasn't really anything I picked up on. I just initially saw the comment and didn't look past it, which is kind of why I designed these sort of floor plate things for so long and stuck with sleep work play. And I'm pretty sure at one point I literally just scrapped the whole thing and was like, yeah, we're not doing sleep work play anymore, we've had enough of it. But that happens a lot, you know. When you're in uni, that happens so many times, it's unreal. And you're like, you know what, I'm just going to start again, like a month in. I wouldn't recommend it. I would just amend your current work and stick with it. Just stick it out. Trust me, it'll get easier. Set up a system to achieve design intentions. This kind of relates to the very rich scheme in terms of what Paul's saying there is, how am I going to achieve all of this work? What is my system that I've got in place? What are my next steps? How do I achieve it? So what I tend to do after every single review is sit down, actually get my feedback, which generally, you know, it depends on the sort of submission. If it's an actual crit review where you've got work on the wall, someone should have taken notes for you, so I'd get their notes back. I would then write out the notes again and add my comments to them, and anything else that I've thought about in the review that I could improve on. So it essentially gives me a to-do list in a way. And if it's, say, we used Canvas in John Moore's, but if we have my review and then we have the sort of 2-week feedback window, we get the feedback, then what I do then is pretty much the same, get all the comments off there, make a to-do list, essentially from sort of compiling all the comments into the sort of one single sheet. Then I'd essentially set dates for each deadline that I need to achieve by. And this method worked really well because it sort of sped me up on this. I was like, right, I've only got a week to fix this and to go to this. And that sort of really benefited me in this sense. But to this day, you know, I still think that was the best diagram of Assemble City. Because it just does remind me of those sort of the houses in Barcelona. But anyway, that was a complete tangent then. So yeah, what we do is we to-do list, dates, achieve, and then, you know, you could even go back to the same tutor who created you and said, is this what you think? But that's a very sort of dependent on the person. If you are the sort of person who needs that consistent feedback on your project, or you're the person who's completely independent and doesn't really care about what the tutor says, you'll sort of see all aspects of people like this within uni, you know? Because I mean, some people can walk into a review and absolutely sell the scheme and it'll be the smoothest talking person in the world. And then you've got other people who struggle with the reviews, but the work they produce is insanely good that the work just speaks for themselves. So you have to kind of figure out where you fit in this environment and then work on your strengths. That would be my best advice for this. And so that was the Stitch sort of snippet in a way that we've just covered. So this was sort of this sort of turning point of this project, and the next video that I'll be doing will be the development of the concept, so from the stage and from the CDP report. Because the CDP report was a bit weird, we had to kind of submit that after the review, but before the sort of main big review. So it's kind of like a little middle point in a way. Well, not nowhere near a middle point I should say, but middle point for concept design. So yeah. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that if you learned something from this video, then comment down below what you've actually learned. And yeah, if you have any questions or anything to do with reviews, I'm always available for comments or emails or whatever. You can message me directly on Instagram if you'd like. It's completely up to you. But don't forget to subscribe, like this video and share it. If you believe that there's somebody who needs to hear this review, then definitely share it with the university mates or your students or whoever in the world, you know, maybe even your friend across the completely opposite side of the world needs to hear this review. So thank you very much for watching again, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.